All right, well, let's bring in Joel Fitzgibbon now, the Shadow Resources Minister, joining me from Sydney. Joel Fitzgibbon, thanks very much for your time this afternoon. I'll get to John Setka in a moment, but Adani, this approval today, do you welcome the fact that work can now begin on this mine?
Thanks, David. Yes, we welcome the fact that a decision has finally been made. We welcome the decision. We welcome the investment. We welcome the jobs, and in particular, we welcome the opportunities for Indigenous employment in central Queensland.
Your colleague Mark Butler, of course, argued that opening up the Galilee Basin was not in the national interest. Do you think it is in the national interest?
Well, despite our lack of enthusiasm, David, pre-election for the mine itself or the mine application, our position has been very consistent. We've said it all along that it's got to be able to stand on its own 2 feet without taxpayer subsidies, and it's got to jump the most stringent environmental tests or hurdles. And today it did both of those things, or demonstrated it could. And on that basis, we should be welcoming it. We do welcome it, and we welcome the jobs it will create.
So to be clear, you're speaking not just as an individual here, you're stating Labor's position in welcoming this approval.
Absolutely. It's met the 2 tests we set for it pre-election and even earlier than that. It's demonstrated what claims to be able to operate on its own 2 feet without any government subsidies. And according to the Queensland government, it's now jumped all those environmental hurdles and, of course, allegedly has jumped all the Commonwealth approvals processes. So on that basis, Labor welcomes the investment and it welcomes the jobs.
What do you say, though, to many in Labor ranks who will be concerned about opening up the Galilee Basin and the impact that will have on global warming? Do you share that concern?
Well, I simply remind them, David, that it's been the Labor Party's policy for eons and will continue to be Labor policy to allow the mining of our coal resources and to export those coal resources to those nations, particularly in Asia, including developing nations who have a strong demand for that product. We have a very valuable resource under our ground. And look, in 50 years, David, it might be quite valueless because the world will move on to other forms of energy sources. And we should be exploiting that resource while we can extract that value and while we can create the jobs.
So to be clear, Labor has no problem with the expansion of coal mining.
Labor should welcome both the expansion of existing mines and new mines because demand for our relatively efficient and clean coal will remain strong for decades to come. That's what all the experts tell us. And of course, by exporting our relatively clean and efficient coal, we are displacing dirtier and less efficient coal. So in that sense, we're making a contribution to the reduction of greenhouse gases and at the same time, creating wealth here in Australia. That is unequivocally a good thing.
So this new coal mine is helping in the fight against global warming. Is that your argument?
Well, when you displace dirty, inefficient coal, David, with clean, relatively clean and efficient coal, then of course you're having you're making a positive contribution to the environment.
How do you know that's what's happening here?
Well, because we know if Australia doesn't provide its cleaner and more efficient coal, and I thank you for your complimentary remarks on the Hunter Region's coal, then those countries will be forced to source their coal from other sources and therefore from countries producing less clean and less efficient coal. Now, these developing countries in particular, David, will need all the coal, gas, solar, wind technology they can secure as they seek to go through their own industrial revolution. We should assist them in that process while at the same time displacing dirtier coal and creating wealth and jobs here in Australia. The Labor Party has always held that position and I don't see that changing.
Should we use more of, based on that argument, should we use more of this coal in Australia?
Well, the market will determine how much demand there is for our coal in international markets. We could use more coal here in Australia, but we're highly unlikely to build more coal-fired generators because the investors simply aren't interested in doing so. So when our current coal-fired generators come to...
But why is that, Joel Fitzgibbon? Isn't part of the reason for that Labor has held this position for years now, the 45% emissions reduction target?
No, it's got nothing to do with that, David. You need at least a 40-year time frame to get your return on an investment in a coal-fired generator, which is between $3 and $5 billion. So you need a significant timeline for a decent return. And the reality is that investors and we don't know what the energy system is going to look like in 10 years, let alone in 30 years. And in addition to that, of course, the cost of producing power from renewable sources continues to fall. Already it's cheaper than coal production, energy from coal production. So investors look at how those prices are declining on renewables.
But if it's cheaper to use renewables already than coal, why isn't India doing that?
Because India and other large developing nations, including China, are producing all the coal-fired and renewables and gas-fired generation they possibly can. Their demand and growing demand is so great that they need all the power they can get from all the sources possible.
But don't we as well?
No, because we're a modern, wealthy economy, well placed to construct and invest in and construct renewable forms of energy. People are doing that, not to the extent we would like, because we've had 10 years of investment uncertainty. This is the big problem with power prices in Australia, David. Two problems. One, the cost of transmission. We are a large country, sparsely populated. And of course, second, for the last 10 years, because of the destructive attitude of the coalition forces, we've had investment uncertainty. But investors aren't going to go to coal. At least I'd be very surprised if they do. They're going to run to renewables. They are doing that in a big way now, but they'll do that increasingly into the future. And the more they do that, the less likely it will be that someone would invest in a coal-fired generator. But can I just make this point, David? In my own Hunter region, up to 90% of the coal we produce is exported. So there's not such a relationship as some would have you believe between coal mining and coal-fired generation. I mean, theoretically, you close all of the coal generators down in my electorate tomorrow, and you'd still produce. Now, you wouldn't want that to happen, and it won't happen, but you would still continue to produce as much coal. In fact, the coal would probably secure a higher price on export markets than it does in the domestic market. So there's not really a direct link between the two. But we will have coal-fired generation in Australia for at least 15 years, at least probably 20 years in the case of some of those generators, particularly in Queensland, maybe more in Queensland actually. But eventually, when they run to the end of their physical lives, renewables will have taken such a hold and battery storage will have improved so significantly that no one will be investing in new coal-fired generators. Now, that's not a decision of government, that's a decision of the market and of investors.
You mentioned the Hunter Valley coal exports there. Will opening up the Galilee Basin have any impact commercially on the Hunter Valley coal miners?
Well, some experts say it could pose competition for Hunter Valley coal. I suspect that's not true. I believe demand globally will remain so strong that we'll be able to sell all the Queensland coal and all the Hunter Valley coal we can. So I don't think it's an issue, but theoretically you could say that Central Queensland and Hunter at some point in time could end up in competition with one another on some of those Asian markets. But if that does happen, I think it's a long way off. At some point, David, maybe not to 2050, even these now developing nations, China, India, etc., will move further and further to renewable sources or new sources of energy. We don't even know about that, including hydrogen-based sources of energy. So at that point, whenever it might be, they'll stop buying our coal. Hopefully that's a long way off, but the time will come.
Let me turn finally, Joel Fitzgibbon, to the John Setka saga. Do you think he should be expelled from the Labor Party?
Yeah, I agree with Anthony Albanese. The test we set for, like any organisation, whether it be your local Lions or Rotary Club or your local church, you set standards and an image for your association. The Australian Labor Party sets a high standard. It's a subjective standard, if you like. It's one we set for ourselves. We're not talking about a test which might be applied in a court of law, for example. And we have come to the conclusion that the image promoted by John Setka is not consistent with the image and the brand we like to promote for the Australian Labor Party.
And why is that? I mean, image is a pretty broad thing. Is it because of apparent comments he made about Rosie Batty?
Well, there are a whole range of things which has had media publicity over recent years with respect to John Setka. I'm not going to repeat them here. But suffice to say that...
So it's a mix, of issues.
A mix of issues, and we don't want people looking at the behaviour of John Setka and seeing that as brand labour. We don't think it's consistent with brand labour, and I think Anthony Albanese has called it right.
If he stays, and his shop stewards certainly want him to stay, should the Labor Party remain affiliated with the CFM-MEU? Should it keep taking its donations?
Look, I think what happens within the union movement is entirely a matter for the union movement, and I don't think that we should be trying to interfere.
But I'm asking about Labor's relationship with this union.
Well, you're asking me for a hypothetical, David. I'm not going to answer it. We'll let the union movement...
Well, it's not hypothetical. He's saying he's not going. He's saying he's staying. He wants to stay. He says he'll stay.
And I'll let the party organisation make those decisions.
All right. Joel Fitzgibbon, Shadow Resources Minister, thanks very much for joining us this afternoon. Appreciate that.